Hi guys, welcome to this week's episode of Let's Talk Boxing. As always, I'm your host Luke, and I'm joined by Ewan. And Ewan, unfortunately, we've had a big weekend of boxing action, boxing headlines, knockouts, big victories. But we have to start this podcast on somewhat of a somber moment. The boxing world, unfortunately, lost one of its most iconic figures of all time. The hours preceding Saturday night's highly anticipated boxing, the news broke of the untimely passing of one of the all-time great boxers in Marvellous Marvin Hagler, one of the four kings, a man who dominated the middleweight division for a long, long time and dominated boxing throughout the 1980s, and who no doubt is at the top of many boxing fans' list of all-time favourite fighters. Ewan, it was a tough one to take. The outpour on social media was just a microscopic vision of how popular Marvin Hagler was and what a man he was, what a fighter he was.
Yeah. I was genuinely very moved. He was only quite a young fella, and to see somebody who was so indomitable in the ring, who was so tough, who was so game, who was so fit, to be taken away from us at a young age, it's really, really upsetting. I grew up watching, I've said this on the podcast before, I grew up watching Hagler Hearns and Hagler Leonard. I have such fond memories of Marvin Hagler, and me and my dad over the weekend, we watched on Friday night, before obviously any of this broke, we watched John the Beast Mugabe versus Marvin Hagler just for fun. And my dad was showing me pictures. He used to have big posters of Hagler in his room in the 1980s. And that was in the northwest of England. The cultural impact that Marvin Hagler had. He was such a workman-like guy. He wasn't the flashy of Leonard or the power of Hearns, but his determination, his physical will to win, it made everybody love him. He captured the imaginations of people on all continents. He transcended boxing in a way. He was the workman's fighter, and he'll be sorely missed.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that stands out so much for me when it comes to Marvin Hagler, no doubt I'm not a fan in the ilk of yourself or in the ilk of your old man, but Marvin Hagler, he never had it easy coming up. He had it so tough. He had a great family life, but the area he grew up in was rife with crime and poverty and race wars and everything else, and police brutality. And then that transitioned into his boxing career. For a long time, I think it was 6 years he was a professional for before he got a world title shot. And he was once told by Joe Frazier, it's never forgotten that he has three things going against him. One, that he's black, one, that he's a southpaw, and one, that he's good. And he overcame obstacles throughout his career, and winning that world title against Alan Minter in London was the start of a legendary career.
Yeah, that overcoming adversity is massive, and he won fans by overcoming adversity. 6 years to get a world title shot, but then he was robbed in the world title shot. He got a draw against Vitor Antuofermo, and then he came to London, and even when he won the world title in a devastating performance against a great fighter like Alan Minter, he had beer bottles and beer cans chucked at him, and he didn't get presented his belt in the ring. Everything went wrong for Marvin Hagler. But when he retired after the Sugar Ray Leonard fight, which again you can say was hardship and went against him, he was more loved than any of them. He inspired people because of the adversity that he faced, because things were unfair for him. That's why people loved him, because he fought through despite that.
In the face of such adversity, I think another one of his massive traits was his loyalty, sticking with the Petronelli brothers throughout his career, sticking at middleweight throughout his career. He knew what he was, and he knew what he was good at, and he knew the people around him that was good for him. So many times boxers or boxing prospects, especially in the 60s, 70s and 80s, when the financial advice and the living skills wasn't as preachable as they are nowadays, boxers such as Mike Tyson at the very top of the game were time and time again used and abused, and Hagler knew to stick to those closest to him, and the Petronelli brothers will forever be linked to Hagler. But Ewan, I think, you look at his record: 66 wins, 3 losses, 2 draws. He avenged a couple of those losses. The only one that he didn't avenge would have been what proved to be the last fight against Ray Leonard. He resisted all calls to come out of retirement. He got obviously a split decision loss to Ray Leonard, a controversial split decision loss to Ray Leonard, but he avenged losses to Willie Monroe and Bobby Watts. But I think what he'll be most remembered for, no doubt, is those 8 minutes with a certain hitman, Thomas Hearns. Ewan, it's a fantastic fight. If you used to ever go and show somebody that doesn't know boxing, any fight of all time, you got the fight of the century. We spoke about that last week. You've got your Golovkins, your Canelos, your Joshuas, and your Klitschko's and your Fury and your Wilders, but nothing quite compares to April 15th, 1985 and Hagler Hearns brutality at its finest.
For my money, it's the greatest fight of all time. It's the single greatest fight of all time because it is competed at a level of skill which is very, very rare. It's two all-time greats fighting each other. It's two dangerous fighters. But then they go hell for leather from the second it starts to the second it finishes. And, I talked about in my memories article, the enduring image is Hagler cut, the famous quote about his big bald head being cut open. It's a boxing glove because he breeds boxing. And it's him cut and bloodied, felling, the enormous, the kind of almost insurmountable challenge of Tommy Hearns. And then that last punch where Tommy Hearns falls backwards and it's like somebody shouting timber, as he falls. But Hagler just, he was like I said in the article, it reminded me of the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley, bloody but unbowed. It's that you could throw anything at Marvin Hagler and he just fought through it. He bit down on that gun shield. He took the pain and he made it work for him because he just had a fire inside him that could not be quenched, and that's what we're remembering for, that raw power, that indignant attitude, that I will not be beaten by any man. Absolutely.
And I watched a documentary around the Hagler Hearns fight. I think it was one from HBO back in the day. And they mentioned a couple of things that stood out for me, amongst others. But in the build up to the fight, Hearns was a lot more flashy and a lot more outgoing than Hagler. And that was somewhat out of character, it seemed. He seemed like he was the one that was trying to sell the fight a little bit more because Hagler just would be himself, he wouldn't sell out as such, and he didn't need to do anything braggadocious or controversial. But there's a quote where he says, "I'm off to jail." And that was his way of saying he's going into camp, and he kind of disappeared off the face of the earth to prepare for Hitman Hearns, whereas Hearns was, he had one of the biggest entourages in boxing. Everybody was around him and he loved the attention and being centre of attention. And that certainly played a part in the build-up to that fight. You could see pictures of him training and he'd have media and friends and fans and hangers-on all around, whereas Hagler was away, he was boxed off, he was doing his thing. And then also the other thing that caught my eye, Ewan, was during the fight when he got that cut and it was in between his eyes. And, the blood could have been trickling into his eyes. And, we could have been robbed of the greatest fight of all time had that fight been called off because it was a bad cut and it was going into his line of vision. But there's a voiceover, you have to forgive me, I'm not sure who it was who had the voiceover, but he was talking about Hagler and this kind of surmised his battle in life and boxing. And he felt like it was going to be took away from him again, that they was going to stop this fight on a cut. And as you said, on his maiden world title fight, he was awarded a controversial, very controversial draw. And he felt like, again, in the biggest fight of his career, that it was going to get took away from him yet again. And that's what ignited the fire inside him to go on and be so brutal and be so determined to be victorious against Hearns. And he went and knocked him out. And it was a sensational victory. And yeah, he went on to lose to Leonard, but you can ask any boxing fan, the victory over Thomas Hearns far outweighs the loss to Sugar Ray Leonard. And the fact that he retired on that split decision loss and he stuck to his guns is admirable. And again, just another indication of his sheer willpower.
Yeah, you talk about the entourages there, and just as a final point, something that Goody Petronelli said about this fight afterwards is that they could hear all of the Hearns entourage banging on the walls and shouting and screaming, and Hagler was stood there with just Pat and just Goody, and he punched himself in the head, and he said he can't take him in there with him. And it just surmises the Hagler attitude. He didn't care. It was mano a mano. It was, I want it more than you. And it was as simple as that for Hagler. And that's why it'll be so fondly remembered.
You certainly will. And our thoughts, our prayers are with the Hagler family. You're moving forward, right back in the thick of it with great fights, great shows popping up all around us this past weekend. We had a bona fide fight of the year contender in Estrada Chocolatito 2. We had a cracking MTK card on the Friday night. And the return of David Benavidez up at super middleweight. He's undefeated. He's two-time WBC super middleweight champion. And he has lost the belt twice out of the ring to his misdemeanors. We'll get onto that later on. But let's get straight into it. Saturday night, Sunday morning here in the UK, Dazn Juan Francisco Estrada against Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, the rematch, 8 years in the making, and boy, did it deliver. You in this fight between hardcore fans. You know, it didn't get the mainstream appeal, but between hardcore fans, this was beat to death. It was prediction videos, there was arguments and counter arguments left, right, and centre, but it delivered, and there was no real surprise that it delivered, but we were still sat in shock and awe at the sheer brilliance of these two super flyweights. Juan Estrada picked up the victory, controversially in the eyes of some, and he is now the unified WBA and WBC super flyweight champion. But Ewan, what a great fight.
What an incredible fight. You know, it's one of those, it's very rare. And I was, after all of our billings last week and us going, it's going to be this fight that is going to be just, you know, back and forth and amazing and incredible. I thought it's going to be a stinker now, but it was absolutely the opposite. You know, these guys were supremely fit for starters. You know, they threw hell for leather. They threw such a staggering output from the first bell to the last. Both men were in the fight from the first bell to the last. The swings in momentum were just dramatic and engaging, and you just couldn't take your eyes off it. I was absolutely blown away by first of all, the conditioning of guys who've been operating at this level for so long, but also the heart and the will to win. And even no matter what you think of the scores, both of those guys were very much in that fight at the end. So, and it was, 100% a bona fide first ballot fight of the year contender.
Definitely. And let's get the controversy out of the way early doors, Ewan, so we can just bask in the brilliance of the fight. The 117-111 card from Carlos Sucre, which was in favour of Juan Estrada, which has now led to the suspension of the judge by the WBA, which is a sign, or a good sign, of things that might come down the line. But that comes on the same day we got the announcement of Ebony Bridges against Shannon Courtney for the WBA Bantamweight World title. So you kind of get one good announcement and then one laughable announcement, but we'll touch on that fight another time, I'm sure. But yeah, the controversy for me surrounds the winning margin for Estrada. I don't think it's the fact that Estrada was awarded the fight. Very similar to, I think it was Canelo against Golovkin, and a lot of people look back on that with quite a lot of resentment and a bit of bitterness because it was a split decision draw. But one of the judges, did they give it to Canelo, but 118, 110, or 118, 111, something around that kind of margin. And I think it's the margin of victory that causes the controversy. I don't think it's that guy getting the fight, and then in the days and the hours and the weeks preceding the fight, social media nowadays is awash. As soon as like a controversial card comes out, you know, you never see judges getting praised, but you'll see a judge get hammered. And I'm not defending the judge, not by any stretch of imagination, because it's awful. But my point being is that this takes away from Estrada the same way it took away from Zelfa Barrett in his fight against Kiko Martinez. He has no control over the judges. And the same way Estrada had no control over the judges this weekend. So yeah, let's bask in the glory of the fight. And yes, the scorecard was wide, but if you had Estrada winning, I don't think that's a bad take. You know, personally, I was happy with a draw or one round either way. I wasn't scoring it on the night. I've not scored it since. I was just enjoying the fight.
I scored it when I watched it, and I scored it 115, 113 to Chocolatito. But again, that's a one round margin or 2 round margin, just of him being just the ever so slightly slicker operator. But there was some very, very close rounds in there. There was 3 or 4 that could have gone either way, where there was that swing in momentum that I talked about that happened mid-round, where it depends how you saw it, whether you were paying more attention at the beginning of the round or the second round, or whether you like the counter-punching of Estrada or the slickness of Chocolatito. It was a pick and fight for me. Again, 1 round either way or a draw, totally understand it. 117, 111 is bad, but everybody knows it's bad. Let's just get back to the fight. It was a fantastic fight, and I hope we get a trilogy fight now, because they're one each, and that's really important. So, again, we've got to go back to how good the fight was. And again, I talked about this with Hagler and Hearns, the level that it's being competed at. You know, we see world title fights most weeks. This was a world title fight of world title fights. This was the elite of the elite. Guys who are fighting on millimeter margins and the tiniest of feints and movements and footwork. You know, it was like, you know, they buzz around each other like bees, don't they, at the lighter weights. And it was just, everything was executed at such a phenomenally high level. And that's what you've got to stress the most. You know, the reason it was so tight on the scores is because both of these guys were landing efficiently and landing effectively from round 1 to round 12, because they're just that good.
Absolutely. I think I said in my post-fight reaction video, which is up on YouTube, that the brilliance of the fight was in the simplicities of the fight. The fact that there was no need to sell it other than it being a great matchup. You know, and when the best fight the best, boxing is the most simple sport to manage in the world. You know, you don't have to have promoters and advisors and TV stations muddying the waters. If you just put the best in with the best, they will deliver 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100. And that's what we had here. Record-breaking numbers in terms of punches thrown, with 2,529 combined punches thrown by both men, which is a record at super flyweight, and I'd say a record at the majority of weights as well. Even for me, I think the interesting aspect of the fight, which is kind of getting overlooked or doesn't really get discussed, is when we look at the controversy of the scoring. I see the difficulties coming. You know, I might look back and try and score it myself, but we had Estrada, who's the boxer puncher. We had Chocolatito, who's so smooth and it almost looks effortless at times, and he throws power punches without loading up. But he wanted to stand and trade. And the general consensus was that he wanted to stand and trade to win the fight, and Estrada would win the fight on the back foot, counter punching, being a little bit more sharper. But for me, I thought Estrada was having his most success when he stood and traded with Chocolatito. So then people might have been swayed thinking, well, if Estrada's fighting Chocolatito's type of fight, he's out of his comfort zone, but he was still having success. And for me, that's what swayed my viewing on the fight. Again, I'm not really going to say who I had winning, losing, or drawing because I wasn't scoring. But I think Estrada, he can have every right to think he won the fight because his successes was coming in fighting his opponent's kind of fight. But then if you look at that from Chocolatito's point of view, if he's got Estrada to come out of his game plan and stand and trade, then he can have every right to feel like he's won the fight. It was so good. And I said rounds 4, round 6 in particular, round 7 and round 12, these are all going to be contenders for round of the year. The fight itself is going to be so tough to beat in terms of fight of the year. You look at Taylor Ramirez, Fury Joshua, Canelo, and whoever he fights this year, whether it be Saunders or Plant, these fights are going to get millions and millions more views. But that can't take away from what was a great fight on Saturday. And this sets the bar for what all other fights in 2021 are going to be compared to when it comes to fight of the year.
100%, 100%. I think that, not to bring it back to Hagler, but it's just on my mind, you know, obviously with everything that we've been talking about, the Hagler-Leonard fight, you know, that was a super, super close decision, you know, and it's still argued about to this day. But the reason that Leonard won that fight was because he controlled the narrative of the fight. You know, the consensus was Leonard has to be on the back foot to win. And even if they were fighting, they fought the entire fight at Leonard's distance, at Leonard's, the way he wanted to fight. So even though Hagler was landing brilliant blows, and was probably landing more of them more often, because the judges had seen the narrative of the fight, and Leonard looked so confident and so smooth, and he looked like he was fighting his fight, that people were inclined to give him close rounds. And that's what happened in that fight. So the same thing, I think, has happened with Estrada. Like you say, the consensus is that if Estrada's kind of, the narrative is that Estrada, if he can do both, if he can be on the back foot and the front foot, which he was for large portions, then he's winning the fight, even if the actual punches landed were a lot closer. Do you know what I mean? It's about that, explaining the narrative of the fight. And that's it from Chocolatito. That's one of the things that he struggled with, was controlling that narrative rather than, and I think Estrada did a better job of that, even if Chocolatito was landing more punches.
I think after timing is such a great term in boxing. You know, Big Steve Buns, he loves it on the Five Live podcast. But after timing, you know, Gonzalez was written off after the 2 losses to Cesar Getso Rungvisai, who himself picked up a victory this past weekend. He knocked out Sidney Seng in Thailand. So, you know, let's not write off Cesar. He's right in the mix. Rungvisai, he's right in the mix at 115 pounds. But yeah, when he defeated Chocolatito, and he was the first man to defeat Chocolatito, he beat him on points, and then he knocked him out brutally. At that point, the general consensus again was that Gonzalez was done. He was up and around number 1 in terms of pound for pound rankings, and it looked like he was being lined up by Matchroom when he went in with Kal Yafai a couple of years ago now. Or was it a year ago? Was it 2020? And he knocked out Kal Yafai, and then he picked up a win after that against Israel Gonzalez, and he's looked as good as ever. And coming into this fight, again, that's what made it such a good fight, is that it was the best fight and the best at the right time. Yes, Chocolatito's 33, but he was a prime 33, and he's adjusted his game, and he's come up in weight. He's a 4-weight world champion. It was so good. We could sit here and wax lyrical. We wouldn't even have to say anything. We could put the fight on and it would just literally be, ooh, ah, no, ooh, and that's how good of a fight it was.
One thing I do want to talk about is Chocolatito's style, because I was watching it. This is one of the big takeaways I had from the weekend is, you can always compare styles. Estrada's this kind of Mexican boxer puncher. You can look at different boxer punches and see where he has similarities. I don't think I've ever seen anyone, and I've watched a lot of boxing, I don't think I've ever seen anyone who is so smooth but always going forward. You know what I mean? The smoother fighters, the guys who have that kind of timing that Chocolatito has and that kind of flowing nature, most of those are back foot, cerebral counter punches, and then they're using it off the back foot to kind of time their opponent. I don't think I've ever seen a guy with that sort of skill and that sort of game plan who continually moves forward. I think there's obviously a few people you could compare it to, but it's such a unique style. And again, I don't think there's a kind of a direct comparison. He's made this style his own and really unique. And I just want to comment on that because I just thought it was beautiful. I think that it shows that boxing is always evolving and always changing, and there's always some new innovation that a fighter will find. And I think Chocolatito's style will be much emulated, but never quite repeated.
Definitely. So at £115 now, we're looking at a trilogy fight between Juan Estrada and Cesar Rungvisai. Those guys have split 2 fights, 1 win apiece. But there is going to be the drive and the desire and the hunger to see a rematch or a third fight again between Estrada and Chocolatito. I wouldn't argue with either of those. But even these guys at super flyweight, we mentioned it before about Maloney and Franco and Nietes and Ioka and Tanaka. Again, we keep saying it, but you pick any 2 out of those guys and you've got world-class boxing against world-class boxing. It's going to deliver. We're not talking about, we have the complaints about Canelo fighting Avni Yildirim, and we have the complaints of Terence Crawford and, the possibility he's fighting Josito Lopez next. And these guys, these other pound-for-pound contenders are not consistently taking on the very best opponents. But you've got a super flyweight division there, which deserves so much more attention than it currently gets. It deserves maybe 1 or even 2 World Boxing Super Series, such as the talent there or thereabouts. It is mouth-watering to think some of the fights we're going to get there, Ewan.
100%. We've just again, I keep repeating that, but we've just had the 2 top guys. We've had the 2 top guys fight each other, but the best one might be Ioka. I think Ioka might be the best one out of the 3. The fact that we have 3 guys who have legitimate claims to the top spot in this division just shows you how deep it is. And then there's been a world title contested between 2 other guys, but equally at a really high level in Franco and Maloney, And then you move down, we've got British guys, but we've got the likes of Tanaka, who I think against any other kind of contender would have done an absolute number on him that night on New Year's Eve. There's so much talent at super flyweight. You can't sleep on the little men anymore. We are. I'm guilty of it as anyone. I love a big heavyweight clash. The magic of the middleweights and the history of there. You're always inclined to look heavier, but you can't sleep on super flyweight at the moment. I think it has a legitimate argument to be the hottest division in boxing right now.
It really does. You mentioned there about Ioka, Kazuto Ioka. He defeated Tanaka and New Year's Eve. And Ioka now has claims to be the number 1 super flyweight on the planet. But going into that fight, Tanaka was a big favourite. Ioka was the underdog and he scored the stoppage victory. And again, that goes to show the depth of where the bookmakers are getting it wrong, boxing fans are getting it wrong. Chocolatito was past it. Now he's number 1 or number 2 or number 3 in the division. Cesar Rungvisai, he scores 2 wins over Chocolatito. He scores a point win over Estrada, but then he loses to Estrada, and then next minute he's kind of discarded. This division is so good. And yeah, my final point being is let's get a World Boxing Super Series or something to that effect, and let's find out who is universally accepted as the number 1, because we said it before earlier in the podcast about arguing about certain points. We could literally sit here and we could get a couple of the guys on and we could all have separate arguments for who's the number 1, 2 and 3 at £115. You moving forward further down the card on Saturday night, which is quite a good card considering the high-profile main event. We had another rematch on the undercard in Jessica McCaskill against Cecilia Brackhouse. It was for the undisputed welterweight title fight. The first fight was an upset victory for McCaskill. She became the first person to defeat Cecilia Brackhouse in 37 fights. And she went on to repeat that feat on Saturday night. And in the end, it was quite wide on the scorecards. Again, it weren't really controversial because the right lady won. But for me, it was surprising in which the pace that McCaskill set early doors, she came flying out the traps. And obviously, there's the contentious setting in female boxing that is 2-minute rounds and it's a 10-rounder. So it's a little bit more difficult for a female boxer to find a way into a round, or conversely to flip around on its head. We've seen so many times in boxing when somebody starts fast in the opening minute and then they have 2 minutes more to turn that round around. You don't have that benefit in female boxing, and maybe that's where Cecilia Brackhouse was found out on Saturday night, because Jessica McCaskill flew out the trap. She put it on at the start of each and every round. Brackhouse had her success in the middle to late rounds, but it just wasn't enough. And you and Jessica McCaskill from nowhere now, she looked like she was a bit of she's a former world champion, but she was found out at the top level against Katie Taylor. But now she's a bona fide world-class female boxer in her own right. And it looks like she's got the choice of maybe a fight against Katie Taylor, another rematch, or maybe Clarissa Shields. He was talking Clarissa Shields coming down to 147. So it's gone from McCaskill, who, let's not forget, was homeless as a child. She's got a fantastic backstory in overcoming adversity herself. And now she's sitting atop the welterweight division and the world is very much her oyster.
Yeah. First of all, I called it last week. I did say that McCaskill's got a number, and I think she absolutely has. But also, McCaskill's got a number of the 2-minute rounds. The story of 2-minute rounds, and I'm going to keep banging the drum on this because it needs to change. But the story of 2-minute rounds is, if you can start fast and you can win the first 45 seconds of every round, you've won the fight. Because all you need to do is be fast, because there's not enough time, like you say, to turn that round around. If you do a strong minute and then back up, especially if you're the fitter person, which, Brackhouse at 39, McCaskill a lot younger, she's got that physical advantage. You can manipulate a system where, there's a reason we have 3-minute rounds in boxing, because it's that sort of time that it's the right length of endurance for a human being, not a man or a woman, a human being. And Jessica McCaskill played the system, right? And I don't blame her for doing it. And she did it very well, and she won the fight deservedly so, in my opinion. But the problem is, as well as that, I think there's an argument for both women here, right? Because Cecilia Brackhouse wasn't allowed to get back into that fight because of the 2-minute rounds. She wasn't allowed to show her. She wasn't allowed to old woman her. She wasn't allowed to kind of use that, tire her out, figure her way out into that fight, kind of get her breath back, because McCaskill flew out the gates and then slowed off. And you can do that when it's 2-minute rounds. But also for McCaskill, she was robbed of a highlight reel knockout. She could well have stopped her if she was given that time to get into that round. If you look at men's boxing in the rounds, they mostly occur right before the end. You know what I mean? Because you've got that round to get in. If you're tired, that's when your guard drops, because at the end of that 3 minutes, 2 minutes 40, 2 minutes 50, that's when your guard drops. That's when the big shots come in. And that's when we get knockouts. And knockouts sell boxing, whether you like it or not. The reason people like boxing is because they like knockouts. The reason people make money is because they like knockouts. The reason Deontay Wilder was protected for so long is because he was great at knockouts. That's the reason he earned all that money to fight Fury. The reason Josh was the biggest star in this country, the reason he can sell out 90,000 at Wembley, knockouts. Women are being robbed of knockouts. Women can't compete, and we talk about the gender pay gap. The reason they don't get paid is because they don't knock people out. They're not entertaining in the same way. The reason that happens is because they're being denied the chance to compete on a level playing field with men. So I'm going to bang the drum, and I know it's boring, and I know I've said it before, but I just think that it's unfair on them and it's unfair on the fans, and it's got to change because it's archaic and we need to get rid of it ASAP.
Definitely, I certainly agree, and it's such a bizarre situation because the boxers want it changed, the fans want it changed, the promoters seemingly want it changed. It just seems to be like there's nobody to take accountability. Such is the way with boxing. We say this time and time again when it comes to decision making within our sport, that there's no one overriding governing body the way you have the UFC in MMA, you have FIFA for football. You don't have that one overriding impartial governing body for boxing. It's never going to work. We need something in cohesion between the IBF, WBC, and so on and so on. It's never going to happen. But there's a few fundamental things wrong with boxing, and we're not going to go into that because that would be way too big of a tangent. But gender equality in boxing is changing. We're seeing a lot more in terms of equality, and the next step needs to be 3-minute rounds for female boxing. It needs to be 12 rounds for female boxing. We've got female boxers headlining shows in Katie Taylor. We've got females headlining pay-per-view shows in America in Clarissa Shields. And we've got recognizable female boxing or female boxers on every card, it seems now. You know, you got Tasha Jonas, you got Chantel Cameron, Shannon Courtney, Ebony Bridges. You know, people ridicule these female boxers that are not necessarily world-class, but they're recognizable. And the point is that they're becoming more and more influential, they're becoming more and more relevant. It's no longer a sideshow to the male counterparts, and it's only going to be from channels like ourselves and bigger channels and bigger platforms driving attention and somehow and some way getting this overturned and getting this put right, which would mean 3-minute rounds for female boxing and better championship round fights for female boxing, because as you say, it'll bring more knockouts, it'll bring more eyeballs, and ultimately everyone is a winner.
Yeah, it's the biggest way we can grow the sport, I think, is because the women's side of the game is it's got the most room for improvement, because it's younger, it's 100 years younger, it's got so much more room to improve, and it's got that ground in front of it. But we're putting the brakes on instead of stepping on the accelerator to grow women's boxing. And what we need to do is give them parity, and suddenly watch the car will fly off. The women's boxing will fly, because we are, at the moment, we're driving in second gear and the engine is screaming to go faster. All we need to do is change that gear, take the brakes off, and honestly, we will see the quality improve. We will see the money improve. We'll see the eyeballs improve. It's such a no-brainer, in my opinion.
On Saturday night, Ewan, as well as the Dazn card, there was a card which, in all honesty, wasn't as relevant as the huge Estrada Chocolatito fight, and that's no disrespect to David Benavidez against Ronald Ellis, a super middleweight contest. And, we don't often touch on American boxing for time constraints. We try and keep it relevant to our listeners, but we are picking up a few more American listeners, so shout out to the guys that are listening in the States. But David Benavidez, he stopped Ronald Ellis. He was the first man to stop Ronald Ellis, a prediction that I made correct on the Simbox prediction videos on YouTube. I got 75% of my predictions correct this week, so you and I outdone you there. You got the McCaskill one right, and that was about it. Benavidez, the reason why I'm bringing him up is he's undefeated. He's a former 2-time WBC super middleweight world champion. And he's going to be at some point in line for a fight with Canelo. He's had his out-of-ring shenanigans. He's lost the title on the scales. He came in overweight for his fight previous to this against Angulo. And I think, was it cocaine he tested positive for, Ewan? He failed the drug test for cocaine, and he was stripped of a WBC title there. But he's 24. I think he's 23-0 now, 21 knockouts, something like that. So he's a very relevant player in the game, 168 pounds, and a potential fight with Canelo is not too far off. There's a lot of murmurings about that, and I could imagine maybe Cinco de Mayo 2022, given that Canelo's 2021 seems booked up. But we're looking a year down the line, Canelo Benavidez could be a huge fight.
It's a huge fight because they're both Mexican, but it's not a competitive fight, in my opinion. If you don't win world titles in nightclubs, you win them in gyms. You win them on that dark road walk, not with a hangover. I think that David Benavidez is chronically ill-disciplined. He misses weight. He takes drugs. He goes out drinking. He's not the professional that Canelo is. You look at Canelo, what is he always doing? He wears the ridiculous things to weigh-ins and stuff, but he's always in the gym and he's always fit. And say what you want about him with his drugs and everything like that, there is obviously that is an element of the history. But if you look at what they do now, Canelo works out, he trains, he spars. Benavidez is not the disciplined guy. He's not fighting the top level. He's not at top level. And I think that the reason for that is because he's not proved to be a disciplined fighter. And I think that any element of ill discipline and you will lose to Canelo Alvarez. I think it's as simple as that. So I would really like to see Benavidez up his activity, prove that he can make the weight at 168 pounds, and really start upping the opposition, because ultimately, at the moment, I don't think he's earned a shot, Canelo. Unless he fights some decent contenders and actually makes the championship weight, then he's proved that he can fight Canelo. But at the moment, it's a liability. Because if you put on 90,000 people at Stadium Azteca in Mexico City, which would sell out, all Mexican stuff, and then Benavidez misses weight and Canelo says, I'm not fighting, because he's well within his right to do that if he misses weight, then you've sold 90,000 tickets and there's no main event. You can't gamble like that on a guy as unpredictable as Benavidez.
Well, maybe I'm grasping at straws, given that Canelo was so dominant over Callum Smith, who I thought was going to provide the sternest test at 168 pounds for Canelo, and he was dominant in the way he took apart the Liverpoolian and took the WBC super middleweight title from him and took his undefeated record. And maybe, we're overlooking Caleb Plant or Billy Joe Saunders by saying in 2022 we might have a next realistic challenger for Canelo. But in Benavidez, he's young, he's fresh, he's got ridiculously quick hands. But when I look at this as a physical matchup, I see if Canelo can take apart Callum Smith the way he done, then he most likely will do the same to Benavidez. But Benavidez, if he was to go and fight Jamel Charlo, there's a bit of beef there. We've seen that on social media this week. If he was to go and beat, maybe if he was to, saying that Callum Smith's gone up in weight, but if he was to clash with Callum Smith, that'd be a great fight. That we got to take into context. Yes, he's got his ill discipline out of the ring, but he's still young enough. I'd like to think he's still fresh enough to turn this around. And as you say, if you come back in 2021, he gets another 2 fights in. I'm not sure who's fringe contenders around 168 pounds. We would have to look, but if he can get a couple of reasonable wins in and put himself in with a chance, not just because he's undefeated, not just because he's Mexican and it'll sell well. If he can put himself in there because of a sporting reason, that he's put himself in there as a genuine contender, then I'd be all for it.
That's what I mean. He needs to earn it. He needs to earn it, because I don't think he's earned it at the moment, but he is close and he's obviously marketable. So, if he fought Plant or fought someone like that, he's definitely the next in line. But again, I want to see him have that fight first.
Yeah, most certainly. So let's look back at also Ewan. Friday night, a show a bit closer to home. We had the MC there, Robert Blundell, a good friend of ours. He does the intro to the podcast. He got his show out in Bolton. He was emceeing for the night, and it was a good card, Ewan. It was a good competitive card with some good fights on there. There were some good names in attendance as well, with the likes of Tyson Fury was there, Martin Murray was there, Jack Catchell was there. Again, showing the muscle power and the platform that MTK has become with such a big stable. And this was only, a few members of that stable. But the fight that stuck out for me, and I'm sure for you as well, and we're close to Kieran Farrell in his stable, and he had Ed Harrison step in at 3-4 days' notice to take on a world-class opponent in Isaac Lowe, an undefeated world title challenger in the making in Isaac Lowe. And Ed Harrison done himself, done his fans, done Kieran very, very proud. He put up a tough fight. He lost, such is his life, but he put in one hell of a performance, Ewan.
Yeah, I was mightily impressed by Ed Harrison's. He's, I've put this out on Twitter, and I firmly believe it. I think he's the best fighter in this country with a losing record. I think that if he'd have, committed himself, maybe at a younger age to try and really, push boxing as his career, could well have done it. He's got an iron chin, and he is game as anything. And Isaac Lowe's, the world class operator, and he showed that because he got a bad cut off an accidental clash of heads. We've seen guys losing those fights, the likes of Jordan Gill, who, obviously there's a lot of talk between the two of them. But, Jordan Gill, when things didn't go his way, he lost, he got knocked out. When things did not go Isaac Lowe's way against Ed Harrison, and he battled it out and he won. And he won comfortably, in my opinion. But Ed gave, for every second he was in that fight, he was giving it 100%. And Isaac Lowe had to battle back out of adversity. And for a 6-rounder, it was absolutely fantastic. And it was exhilarating watching. It was back and forth. It was exciting. That's it. It was as simple as that. It was really exciting. And if you can go back and watch it, absolutely do, because it's just mighty good fun, because you can see how much fun Ed Harrison's having in there. Even when he's get bloody and cut and he's fighting against a world-class operator, he's just beaming from ear to ear, just loving it. And it's that you like in boxing. And it's those small hole shows that I'm really glad MTK are now putting on. It's a 6-rounder for Isaac Lowe. In the modern world, normally that would not be on telly. It'd be on at Bolton White. So, you'd have a baying crowd. It'd be great if you were there, but it wouldn't be getting exposure. Now it's on IFL, it's on YouTube, it's on ESPN Plus in America. Guys like Ed Harrison's just got a massive platform. Everyone's gone, oh, he's really good at fighting, and he'll give you prospects a really good go. So I think that it's great that we've got those small hall shows and getting them that exposure. But yeah, if you can go and check out that fight, it is a fantastic little knock.
Definitely. I think the fight itself epitomised that card from MTK. There was some evenly fought contests on there. There was some good knockouts. There was a couple of debuts on the card as well with Jordan Reynolds. He picked up a 6-rounder on his debut. He's got quite a distinct amateur background. He took on Robbie Chapman as a debut opponent, which is no mean feat, and he looked good. in winning there, and Gary Cully scored a good knockout as well. So yeah, the MTK card was really entertaining. We've got another one coming up this week as well, Ewan, and this is a bit more high profile now with Lee McGregor fighting for the European bantamweight title, undefeated Lee McGregor, and you've got Maxie Hughes against Paul Highland Jr. on there for the British lightweight title. Same location, same promoters, same layout really, and again, it's just another indication of the powerhouse that MTK are becoming, because they've got the big names and the big stars and the big stable, but they're also capable of putting on the small hole-esque shows that are giving away fighters like Ed Harrison or giving prospects like Jordan Reynolds the opportunity to get big exposure in their career. So yeah, we look forward to this Friday's MTK show. Also this week, Ewan, before we get onto the big matchroom card on Saturday, headlined by Lawrence Okolie and Christoph Glowacki for the WBO cruiserweight title, Brian Rose, a good friend of ours here at Simbox and a recent signing to Vicious Promotions with Kieran Farrell. He's making a return to the ring. He's been out for quite a while now. I think he might have even been at his last fight against Anthony Fowler in Liverpool, and he lost that night. There's been a couple of returns rumoured, and it's just not come into fruition. But I caught up with Brian recently. He's fighting out in Barcelona on the 20th of March. He's going out there with Bobby, and he's going out with Kieran. I think even Ed Harrison's making an appearance on the show as well. Goes to show Ed Harrison takes on all comers. He's gone from working in Iceland to 2 fights in 2 different countries in 2 weeks. But yeah, Brian Rose, Ewan, he's 35 now. He's been a professional since I was in high school back in 2005. He's 35, 36 years of age now. He's had 38 fights. He's won a British title outright. He's challenged Demetrius Andrade for world titles. Seen it, done it, been there, experienced it all, got the T-shirt and threw up on it. But he's coming back for one last roll of the dice, and I'm certainly on board with it. He's a great guy. We're not sure where it's going to go, but it starts this week in Barcelona.
Yeah, obviously live on FiteTV. We've got a giveaway going for that one, haven't we? I think there's a lot left of Brian Rose. He's had the style of a 35-year-old Brian Rose for a long time. Do you know what I mean? He's got that kind of X factor element of that old school British fighter. You know, he would be at home in the 50s or the 60s middleweight division in this country. You know, he's got a real unique kind of like a USP, like a unique selling point about him. He's a real like tough rock and roller fighter, you know what I mean? He'll go the distance with anyone. And like I say, I think if you put him in at the top level at middleweight, you know, he might not always win, but he'll always give it 100%. You know, he's got that little X factor. And I think it's great to see him linking up with Kieran. I think that there's exciting things that those 2 names can do together. You know, Kieran's obviously massive on the up and up. And, you know, that is epitomised this week by the Spanish road trip as, I mean, Brian, Kieran and Bobby Rimmer drive down to Barcelona. I mean, I wish we had a recording device in that car and we could write up those conversations, because I'm sure they'll be absolutely brilliant.
That's it. And I think the cool thing is with Brian at this point, and if people go back and check on YouTube, the interview that I had with Brian, it's available on the YouTube channel, is the sheer honesty that comes out of the man. He's never once been one for the BS and for overselling himself or for saying things that aren't true. He's had fights with Jack Armfield, who's a good friend of his, and they got in there and they fought simply because the fight was offered to each man. And Brian Rose has been with different promoters and he's had great opportunities in his career. And this just boils down to he's overcome a lot of personal demons and the hunger's still there to fight. He's not in it for the money. You know, he said he's not getting a lot of money to go out to Barcelona. It's just the activity and shaking off the cobwebs. And then the targeting a bigger fight in 2021, the name Scott Fitzgerald will be there and thereabouts. Scott's got his own issues, as we well know. We wish him the best with those issues. I said that to Brian as well. But for those that don't know, and I got Brian to kind of go into it a little bit more in depth than what I'm capable of, Brian Rose, Scott Fitzgerald will always be a big fight, whether it's a comeback fight, whether it's both guys with losing records, whether it's for a British title or whether it's for a bag of Maltesers. That fight will sell. It's a big rival with Preston and Blackpool, and it's been rumoured and scheduled a couple of times and it's fell through. But I still want to see that fight, whether it's one-sided for Scott Fitzgerald, whether or not Brian Rose turns up and causes what would be an upset, you know, with all due respect to Brian. It's a fight that needs to happen, and it's a box that needs to be ticked, and it's a beef that needs to be squashed.
100%, 100%. Me and you both live on the borders of Lancashire. We both know how big a fight that would be for the county of Lancashire. You know, it's 2 of their most talented guys of the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years. You know, they would sell out anywhere in Preston, anywhere in Blackpool like that. It would be a properly local rivalry. It would be the football crowds. It would be rowdy and lively, and the fighters would be rowdy and lively. And I think it's the perfect comeback fight for Scott Fitzgerald. And I think it's a great roll of the dice for Brian Rose. And I think it's a 50-50, if I'm honest.
A little asterisk to that road trip you mentioned there, that Bobby Rimmer, Kieran, Brian, and obviously Ed Harrison's going to be there. But Ed Harrison's going out to fight in Barcelona. And the asterisk being that he's going to be taking on Frank Uruguaga. I think I've murdered his name there, but it's the guy who took on Anthony Crolla in Crolla's last ever professional fight, and that was a contentious points win for Crolla. You know, I love Anthony Crolla, but that was a close fight. Crolla got it on the scorecards. A lot of people was unhappy with that. But yeah, I think that's quite interesting that Ed Harrison's going out to Spain to fight the opponent that Anthony Crolla took on in his last contest.
Another handy operator, you know, he doesn't take easy fights, Ed Harrison, does he? You know, I think that'll be very, very entertaining. I think I'll be tuning in for that.
It's a sign of the times when our podcast usually is consumed by previews and what's coming up. But given that we had such a busy weekend, there's a few headlines that I did want to go into that we've not had time to fit in. But yeah, it's a sign of the times when an upcoming World Championship card from Matchroom is last on the agenda. But this weekend, March 20th, it's a card that's been obliterated by injury, but such is the power of the stable of Matchroom that they've put together. You know, a reasonably entertaining card, but Lawrence Okolie versus Christoph Glowacki for the WBO Cruiserweight World title is the headline act. It's been the headline act from day one. It's been a fight that was close to happening pre-pandemic, and for one reason or another, it's took until March 2021 to get it made. But you and Lawrence Okolie, he's 15-0, 12 wins by knockout, British, Commonwealth, European champion, but he still gets a lot of hate. We've spoke about this before. I put an article out about it before. He's not got the most fan-friendly of style, but linking up with Shane McGuigan, you know, a big knockout win last time out against Glowacki, a massively overmatched Glowacki on the Joshua Pulev undercard. But maybe if that's a little inkling of the stand of the times to come for Okolie, he's got the physical attributes to be a real problem at cruiserweight, and maybe one day moving up to heavyweight, and it all starts this Saturday against Christoph Glowacki.
I think it's a great fight. I think that Lawrence Okolie is massively improved. And again, he was always going to have an uphill battle to expunge the Matty Askin fight from everyone's memory, just because it was just a terrible fight. And that's all anyone remembers him for. But actually, if you look at his last few fights, he's been getting explosive knockouts, and he's been able to leverage that power and use those big, long limbs to get the results that he wants. And I think that teaming up with Shane McGuigan has made him improve massively. I think that he wins on the weekend. I really do. I think that he's got a great future at cruiserweight and heavyweight. He's got such a massive build that if he gets in the gym, lifts some weights, and moves up naturally to be a kind of 215, 220 heavyweight, I think he could be a real problem. I've got a lot of love for Lawrence Okolie, and I am coming round from the Matty Askin fight. But yeah, I think it's a competitive fight. You shouldn't write Glowacki off. You know, he's got that loss he's got a controversial fight with Maris Bradis, but we all saw how good Maris Bradis was when he fought the KO doctor Dorticos. You know, he's moving up to the legit world level with the Glowacki fight, and I think he's ready, and I hope he's ready. But ultimately, we're going to find out on Saturday night. I think it's a great headline. Again, I hope people get behind it because he is a legitimate world title level. It's a world title fight. We've got a British guy in a world title fight, and just because he's had a couple of stinkers with Askin and Chamberlain, we shouldn't hold that against him, and we should support our guy on Saturday night, in my opinion.
Definitely, I think in Glowacki, he's got a great opponent to not only look good against, but somebody that's going to be credible. You look at Glowacki with just 2 losses in 33 fights, and those losses, a contentious loss to Bradis, who's a world-class operator, to Alexander Usyk, who again is a world-class operator. But then he does hold wins over Vlasov, who was scheduled to fight Joe Smith for a world title recently. He holds wins over Steve Cunningham, who gave Tyson Fury a hell once upon a time. And he also holds a win over Marco Huck. So he's got credible wins on his ledger. He's a world-class opponent. And I think, again, this is the kind of fight where if Okolie gets in there and he wins well on points, or if he gets in there and he gets a stoppage, you know, Glowacki's only been stopped once in those 2 losses, and that was very contentious. If Okolie goes in there and stops Glowacki and he stops him well, I think that really will elevate him. You know, inside boxing circles, he's well thought of, well respected, but this might get him that mainstream appeal. And if Eddie starts selling his story, the Lawrence Okolie story, which is a fascinating story himself. We've seen that, he wasn't in the greatest of shape when he was younger, and he worked at McDonald's, and he's turned it all around, and now he's on the verge of being a world champion, and he's come up the traditional way, winning the British title, the Commonwealth title, the European title, and adding prestige to those belts. And now he's going for world honours. So yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I think it's a great Saturday night fight night, main event, world title fight. He's a British guy in a world title fight. Let's get behind him and let's support him, and let's see where the story of Lawrence Okolie goes, because as you say, he's got all the attributes, and if he puts on performance that he is capable of, he elevates his name to the next level. And with Shane McGuigan, as I say, in his corner, he's got the right man there that's kind of working on this power and working on, yes, it's all well and good saying he's got physical attributes, but making sure he can use those in the correct way is what Shane McGuigan's tasked with. And the little snippets we've seen so far is promising. And Saturday night, again, if Okolie goes in there and does a job on Glowacki, then it's a very exciting future for himself.
Yeah, definitely. We've got to recognise those achievements of Glowacki and realise who it is, because if he blows him away, that's a massive statement of intent for the cruiserweight division. That's a I want to unify sort of guy. If you can stop Glowacki, because like I say, Usyk couldn't stop him. So if Usyk didn't stop him and you do, that's a massive statement of intent at cruiserweight and at heavyweight. So I really hope Lawrence can do the job on Saturday night, and I hope it's an exciting fight.
One that disappointed me, Ewan, that was scheduled for Saturday, and we lost it just last week, and it's been lost a couple of times, rearranged and postponed and cancelled, and I'm not sure where we're at with the fight at the minute. It was Chris Billam-Smith against Dion Juma. We banged the drum between ourselves so much for this fight. One, because of how much Chris Billam-Smith's improving and how good he's looked, but two, because of how much Dion Juma's gone under the radar and how much he impressed me against Sam Hyde, a fight that I will never stop banging the drum about. This fight was scheduled, is it back in November, the original undercard to Povetkin White, and then it's been rescheduled again and again and again, and it's fell through again. We've not really seen a reason why, if Dion Juma's injured or whatnot. We wish him the best with whatever's going on. But in Vasyl Dukar, if you read a couple of stories online, this Dukar is not to be overlooked, but I expect Billam-Smith to pick up a win. And then we've got Anthony Fowler, Joe Cordina, Ramla Ali, Ellie Scotney on the card. So, there's some recognisable names that need run-outs, and that's hopefully going to lead to bigger fights in 2021, especially for the likes of Anthony Fowler and Joe Cordina. And then our good friend Bradley Ree, he's got this last-minute call-up against Lee Cutler. Ree at 9-0, Cutler at 7-0. And these guys have been on standby for 2 or 3 weeks now. This fight was meant to go on one of the cards in February. It's put on standby in case something fell through on the Avanesyan and Josh Kelly card. And then that card went off without a hitch, and then it was going to be put on standby for March 6th. And then that card fell apart. So, yeah, it's good to see Bradley Reed finally get that opportunity. He's a good friend of ours. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, it's one of those things, you feel like you're banging the drum because I like him and I talk to him, and I don't want to just be like that. But you've got to respect, the greats from this island who think he's very good. He trains with Ricky Hatton every single day. Ricky Hatton says he's very good, and it's good enough for Ricky Hatton. It's good enough for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to the hitman, Ricky Hatton. But we've boxed off everything that we had to fit in. We did think we was going to struggle. We could have spent the entire podcast talking about Estrada Chocolatito. If and when that trilogy fight gets made, I'm sure we'll look forward to that very eagerly. Shout out to our sponsors, Clint Patrick. As always, check those guys out on Instagram. Big shout out to Boxing Pins. Big shout out to FiteTV as well. We've done a couple of exclusive giveaways with those guys. Now, as Ewan said earlier, we've got the giveaway for Brian Rose, his return in Spain. So check that out on our Twitter feed. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Check out Simbox on YouTube and all social media platforms. Ewan, thanks for your time.
Cheers, mate.